Hey everyone, I never thought I'd be writing something like this, but here we are. I run a mid-sized logistics company. We handle freight, distribution, and last-mile delivery. I built this business from the ground up, and I like to think I know how things run. But lately, complaints had been creeping in, delayed shipments, frustrated customers, and even some grumbling from employees. My leadership team kept assuring me that things were under control. But my gut told me otherwise. So, I did something drastic. I went undercover. I figured if I wanted the truth, I had to see it for myself. I'd be a temp warehouse worker, just another guy loading trucks and sorting packages. No one outside my executive assistant knew. I changed my name, grew some stubble, and put on steel-toed boots. My HR department onboarded me like any other new hire. And just like that, I was in. The first shock. Nobody trained me. My first shift started at 5 a.m. I showed up, expecting an orientation or at least a safety briefing. Instead, a guy named Mike shoved a clipboard at me and said, "Just follow the others." That was it. No explanation of processes, no mention of protocols, just figure it out. I was thrown onto a loading dock with a bunch of other workers, all of whom seemed just as tired and overworked as I felt. By noon, my back was aching, my hands were raw, and I had almost gotten run over by a forklift twice. I quickly realized that most of my employees had learned to cut corners, not because they were lazy, but because they had no choice. If they followed the official safety rules, they'd never meet their quotas. I was still processing this when I overheard something that made my stomach drop. Two guys were talking near the break room. "Man, I swear, payroll screwed me again. Overtime pay is missing for the third time." The other one laughed bitterly. "Good luck getting it fixed. HR just tells you to file a request, and then never gets back to you." That's when I realized, this wasn't just about operations. This was about people. My people. And I had no idea how bad things really were. By the end of my first shift, I was exhausted in a way I hadn't felt in years. My lower back throbbed from lifting boxes, my arms felt like dead weight, and my fingers were numb from handling shrink wrap all day. I had spent over a decade running this business, but this was the first time I truly felt the job. I collapsed onto one of the metal benches in the break room, watching as my coworkers trickled in, grabbing bottles of water and snacks from vending machines. Some pulled out their phones, scrolling mindlessly, while others just sat in silence, their eyes heavy with exhaustion. I was about to introduce myself when a voice cut through the air. "All right, listen up." A tall, broad-shouldered man with a clipboard and a permanent scowl strode in. His name tag read Ray, shift supervisor. I had seen him earlier barking orders, but this was my first direct interaction with him. "We're behind schedule because some people can't move fast enough." His eyes swept across the room, and for a second, I swore they lingered on me. "So, I need a few of you to stay late. Overtime. Mandatory." I expected a few complaints, maybe a groan or two, but nobody said a word. They just stared at the floor or took slow sips of water. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. That's when a guy named Luis, mid-40s, looked like he'd been doing this job forever, muttered, "I already got overtime last week, and they still haven't fixed my paycheck." Ray's expression darkened. "You want to complain about payroll? Take it up with HR." Luis shook his head, staring down at his calloused hands. "HR doesn't answer my emails." Ray scoffed. "Then maybe stop emailing and get back to work." I clenched my jaw. This wasn't the company I had built. At least, I thought it wasn't. Wasted time, broken trust. The longer I worked, the more problems I noticed. Packages were constantly misplaced, causing delivery delays. The scanning system was so outdated that workers had to manually enter tracking numbers, a process that wasted hours every single day. The loading process was inefficient, with workers zigzagging across the warehouse instead of following a logical system. But the worst part? No one seemed to care anymore. At one point, I saw a younger worker, maybe 22, 23, leaning against a stack of boxes, staring off into space. His name was Marcus. I walked up to him and said, "Hey man, you good?" He barely glanced at me. "Just waiting for my shift to end." I gestured to the half-loaded truck beside us. "Aren't we supposed to be loading this one?" He smirked. "Yeah, but the driver called in sick, so it's not going anywhere tonight. What's the point? That hit me. I had built this company on efficiency, speed, reliability. But right here, in one of my warehouses, the people responsible for making it all happen had already given up. They weren't lazy. They weren't incompetent. They were defeated. Why? Because no one had given them a reason to care. The moment that changed everything. That night, I stayed late, pretending I had no ride home. I sat outside on the loading dock, drinking from a vending machine soda, watching as Luis and a few others walked out. "Hey, new guy," Luis called over, "you taking the bus?" I nodded. Luis glanced at the time and shook his head. "Man, you just missed it. Next one's not for an hour." "Great," I muttered, playing along. He hesitated, then sighed. "Come on. I'll give you a ride." We got into his beat-up Honda, the seats covered in old fast food wrappers. The engine rumbled as he pulled out of the lot. For a few minutes, we just drove in silence, the streetlights casting long shadows across the dashboard. Then, out of nowhere, he asked, "You ever feel like nobody upstairs gives a damn about us?" I turned to him. "What do you mean?" He let out a bitter laugh. "I've been here for 7 years. Never been late, never called in sick. And what do I get? My pay's messed up half the time, the supervisors treat us like we're disposable, and we got guys getting hurt on the job because they rush us too much." He shook his head. "Nobody listens. So why should we care?" I wanted to tell him he was wrong. That I did care. But I couldn't. Because right now, as far as he knew, I was just another warehouse worker sitting in the passenger seat of his car. Instead, I just asked, "So why do you stay?" Luis sighed. "Because I got kids, man. And a mortgage. I can't afford to quit." I stared out the window, my stomach twisting. I had spent the past decade growing this business, making sure it was profitable. But somewhere along the way, I had lost sight of the people keeping it alive. That's when I made my decision. Tomorrow, I wasn't just going to observe. I was going to take action. And some people weren't going to like it. The next morning, I arrived early. Not as the CEO. Not as the guy in charge. Just as another warehouse worker clocking in for another shift. But today was different. Today, I wasn't just here to observe. I was here to push. To test. To see just how deep the cracks in my company ran. And it didn't take long to find out. An accident waiting to happen. The warehouse was already buzzing with activity when I stepped inside. Forklifts beeped as they backed up, conveyor belts hummed, and the usual chorus of shouted orders echoed across the cavernous space. Luis spotted me and gave me a nod. "Morning, man. Ready for another day in paradise?" I chuckled, but before I could respond, a loud crash rang through the air. Everyone's head snapped toward the loading docks, where a pallet of boxes had toppled over, scattering packages everywhere. A younger guy, couldn't have been more than 19, stood frozen, his face pale. His name was Andre. He had been rushing, trying to move a stack of boxes by himself instead of using a jack. And now, a mountain of inventory was sprawled across the floor. Before anyone could say a word, Ray stormed onto the scene. "You've got to be kidding me," he barked, marching up to Andre. "Do you know how much time you just wasted?" Andre stammered, I thought I could move it faster this way." Ray's face twisted with frustration. "Faster? You just turned a 10-second job into a 30-minute disaster. Maybe if you actually paid attention, you wouldn't be screwing things up." Andre's hands clenched into fists, but he didn't say anything. And that's when I stepped forward. "Hey, cut him some slack," I said, keeping my voice even. "It's not like he did it on purpose." Ray turned to me, eyes narrowing. "Stay out of this, new guy." I stared him down. Maybe if he had proper training, this wouldn't have happened in the first place. For a moment, the entire warehouse fell silent. Ray's lip curled. "You got a problem with the way I run things?" I shrugged. "I just think yelling at people doesn't make them work faster." Ray scoffed, shaking his head. "You don't know how things work around here." That's when I said it. "Actually, I do." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my company ID, flipping it open so he could see my name. My real name. For a second, Ray didn't move. His face went slack, his brain scrambling to process what was happening. Around us, the other workers froze. Then, ever so slowly, his expression shifted from confusion to panic. The warehouse falls silent. The air was thick with tension. Andre looked like he wanted to melt into the floor. Luis's mouth had fallen open. Ray swallowed hard. You're the CEO?" I nodded. His Adam's apple bobbed as he took a step back. I didn't know." "That's the problem," I cut in, my voice low but steady. "You should know. You should know that the guy you just yelled at is a new hire who never got proper training. You should know that your team is exhausted, overworked, and dealing with payroll mistakes every week. You should know that people here feel like they don't matter." I took another step closer, my eyes locked on his. "But you don't know. Because you don't care." Ray opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. And then from behind us, Luis muttered under his breath, "Damn." A ripple of movement spread through the warehouse. Workers exchanged glances, some smirking, others nodding in agreement. Ray turned to them, his face burning red. "All right, back to work," he snapped. "Show's over." But no one moved. They were waiting. Waiting for me. The real reason morale was low. I turned to face the workers. "All right," I said, my voice carrying through the warehouse. "Let's be real. I've been here for 2 days, and I've seen enough to know that something is seriously wrong." A few guys nodded. Megan, one of the few female workers in the warehouse, crossed her arms and muttered, "You have no idea." I pointed at Luis. "You've been here for 7 years. Have things gotten better or worse?" Luis let out a bitter laugh. "Worse." I nodded, already knowing the answer. I turned to the group. "And how many of you have had payroll issues?" Half the hands in the room shot up. That made my stomach twist. I glanced toward the break room. "And how many of you have ever tried to go to HR about it?" A few hands stayed up. But then slowly, one by one, they lowered. Because HR hadn't helped them. Because I hadn't helped them. I took a deep breath. All right. No more waiting. No more ignoring problems. Things are going to change. Now. The first order of business. Ray was still standing there, his fists clenched. I looked at him and said, "You're done." His eyes widened. "What?" "You're done," I repeated. "Effective immediately." For a moment, I thought he might argue. But he didn't. He just clenched his jaw, let out a shaky breath, and stormed toward the exit. Once the door slammed behind him, I turned back to my team. "Payroll issues?" "Fixed by the end of the week," I promised. "HR not answering emails?" "That stops today." "Training?" "We're revamping the whole system." "And as for mandatory overtime?" "That's over. If you're staying late, you're getting paid for it, and you'll have a say in whether you want to stay or not." A murmur spread through the group. Hope. Cautious, but real. Then Luis, ever the skeptic, crossed his arms. "Boss, no offense, but we've heard promises before. How do we know this isn't just another speech?" "Fair question." I met his eyes and said, "Because I'll be back tomorrow. And the next day. And the day after that. Until I know this place is what it should be." Silence. Then slowly, Luis nodded. "All right. Let's see what you got." And just like that, I had their attention. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. I wasn't sure what to expect when I walked into the warehouse the next morning. Would I be met with skepticism? Resistance? Would they even believe that things were actually going to change? Turns out, it was a mix of everything. The workers were watching me, some with cautious optimism, others with outright doubt. But the real challenge wasn't convincing them with words. It was proving it with actions. And that meant getting to work. Step 1. Cleaning up payroll chaos. First thing on my list? The payroll disaster. After firing Ray, I called an emergency meeting with my HR and finance teams. The look on my payroll manager's face when I told him I'd been undercover was priceless, somewhere between horror and a desperate attempt to justify the mess. I had no idea things were this bad," he stammered. "That's the problem," I shot back. "You should have known." I made it clear. All missing overtime pay would be corrected immediately. No more delays. No more file a request and wait. Every worker would get what they were owed. A new system for tracking hours. Instead of relying on outdated paper timesheets that accidentally got misplaced, we implemented a digital check-in system. Every hour worked was logged automatically. No more excuses. Direct access to HR. Workers shouldn't have to jump through hoops to talk to someone about their pay. I made sure HR reps were on site every day for face-to-face problem solving. When I announced this to the warehouse crew at lunch, there was a long silence. Then Megan, the sharp-tongued but hard-working loader, raised an eyebrow. So you're telling me I won't have to beg for my paycheck anymore? Nope. She nodded slowly. All right, boss. We'll see. That was the general mood, hopeful, but cautious. Fair enough. I still had a lot to prove. Step 2, fixing the culture. Payroll was just one part of the mess. The bigger problem was trust. Workers had been beaten down for so long that they didn't expect things to get better. They assumed that if someone in charge showed up, it was just for a PR stunt. So I did something they didn't expect. I got my hands dirty. For the next few days, I worked with them, loading trucks, sorting packages, even hopping on a forklift, with proper training this time. I wanted them to see that I wasn't just some guy in a suit making empty promises. I was here to understand what they went through. At first, they didn't know what to do with me. Luis just shook his head and muttered, "This is the weirdest damn week of my life." But slowly, things started to shift. The more I worked beside them, the more they opened up. Connor, a quiet but hard-working guy, told me how he had been passed over for a supervisor role 3 times because he wasn't aggressive enough. Megan confessed she had been thinking of quitting because she was tired of being ignored when she brought up safety issues. Andre, the kid who had dropped the pallet, admitted that he'd only been trained for 1 day before they threw him onto the floor. Every single thing they told me made my stomach twist. I thought I had built a company that valued its employees. Instead, I had let a toxic system take over. Step 3, leadership shakeup. The hardest truth I had to face? The problems didn't start with Ray. They started with the leaders I had trusted to run things in my absence. I called a meeting with my regional managers, the people who were supposed to be overseeing operations and making sure things ran smoothly. "I want an explanation," I said the moment they sat down. "How did we let it get this bad?" A few of them exchanged uneasy glances. One guy, Mark, cleared his throat. "Look, Jacob, I know it's not ideal, but we were focusing on numbers. We were meeting our quotas." I cut him off. "At the expense of our workers?" Silence. "That's not sustainable," I continued, my voice sharp. "We're losing good people. Morale is in the gutter. And let's be real, if the workers don't care, how long do you think it'll take before our customers stop trusting us too?" No one had an answer. Good. Because I had one. "We're restructuring leadership," I announced. "From now on, promotions will be based on who actually supports their team, not just who looks good on a spreadsheet." Mark frowned. "You're making changes based on what?" "Complaints from a few warehouse guys." I leveled him with a stare. "No. I'm making changes because I spent a week doing their job and saw firsthand how we're failing them." Mark scoffed, but he didn't push back. He knew he had already lost. And just like that, half the leadership team was replaced. Including Mark. Step 4, giving people a reason to care again. Once the worst of the toxicity was cleared out, I had one final challenge. Getting people to believe that things were changing for the long haul. So I did something radical. I put the power back in their hands. We formed employee advisory panels, real workers from the warehouse who would meet with management every month to discuss what was working and what wasn't. Their feedback wasn't just heard, it was implemented. We introduced performance-based bonuses, not just for hitting quotas, but for teamwork, problem-solving, and helping others. We invested in better equipment, new forklifts, improved scanning systems, and actual air conditioning in the break rooms, which, judging by the cheers when I announced it, was long overdue. And most importantly, we hired from within. Luis, the guy who had given me a ride home that first night, became the new warehouse manager. Megan was promoted to safety lead, overseeing training programs and ensuring concerns were addressed. Connor finally got the supervisor role he had been passed over for. And Andre? Well, he stopped dropping pallets. By the end of the month, something amazing happened. The warehouse floor felt different. People weren't just working. They were engaged. They were looking out for each other. Customers were getting their deliveries on time. And when I walked through the warehouse, people actually smiled. The biggest lesson I learned. Looking back, I realized something painful. I had been so focused on growing my business that I had stopped listening to the people who made it run. I assumed things were fine because I was only hearing from the people at the top. But the real truth? The real story of my company? It was happening on the warehouse floor. In the break room. In the tired voices of workers who had been waiting for someone to actually care. That's a mistake I'll never make again. Now, I make it a habit to go undercover once a year. Not just to check on things, but to remind myself who we're really doing this for. Would you ever go undercover in your own company? Or do you think this was too extreme? Let's talk in the comments. A month after my undercover experience, I walked through the warehouse again, not as a temp worker, but as the CEO. Things had changed. The air felt lighter. People weren't dragging themselves through shifts anymore. Luis, now the warehouse manager, was running things efficiently, cracking jokes while keeping the team motivated. Megan had already flagged 2 safety concerns and fixed them before they became real problems. Even Andre, the kid who had dropped the pallet, gave me a confident nod as he loaded a truck properly this time. But the biggest shift wasn't just in operations. It was trust. People knew their voices mattered now. They knew leadership actually listened. And in return, they cared about their work again. As I walked past Luis, he smirked. Guess you're not just some guy in a suit anymore, huh? I laughed. I'll take that as a compliment. Because the truth was, this experience changed me more than anyone. I had spent years making decisions from an office, trusting reports instead of people. Never again. Now I don't just check the numbers, I check in with my team. Because at the end of the day, a business isn't just about profits or efficiency. It's about people. And if you don't take care of them, nothing else matters. Would you ever go undercover in your own company? Let's talk in the comments.